The evening had stretched longer than I expected after a demanding week in Reno, and by the time the Uber stopped in front of my parents' house, my thoughts were already racing about how the night might unfold. My name is Delaney, and I stepped out of the car with an uneasy feeling that I could not explain, as if my arrival alone had already disturbed the balance of the gathering inside. The moment I walked through the doorway, the room shifted. My dad had returned from a long business trip earlier that afternoon, and he stared at me with a look that carried more confusion than greeting. His voice cut through the chatter from the dining room when he asked, "Why are you arriving in an Uber? What happened to the Tesla I bought you?" I opened my mouth ready to offer something, although I had no idea what to say, but my mom spoke first with a softness that felt rehearsed, rather than sincere. Jenna needed the car more. The words landed with a weight that immediately unsettled the entire room, because everyone understood the tone she used whenever she attempted to smooth over a decision she knew had crossed a line. Before anyone could respond, my dad pushed his chair back with a force that startled several relatives nearby, and his voice rose far louder than usual. "Bring her out here right now." The entire house seemed to stop breathing as footsteps halted, utensils froze, and conversations died mid-sentence while the tension in the air thickened into something unmistakably volatile. If you want to know how everything spiraled from that single moment, stay with me and follow the next part, because the truth unraveled faster than anyone expected. A few months earlier, everything began with an unexpected gift from Dad, a moment that felt like a turning point in my life, because it arrived exactly when I needed something that reminded me I was finally standing on my own feet. That afternoon, my father introduced himself with a rare enthusiasm when he stepped into the driveway and handed me the keys to a brand new Tesla, while saying that he wanted to acknowledge the work I had put into building my position at my new firm. It was the first time in a long while that I felt genuinely seen by him, and I still remember the warmth of that appreciation resting over me like a promise I had earned through effort rather than luck. The celebration lasted briefly because my mom revealed a different reaction that she tried to hide behind a polite smile. For someone who usually applauded any family achievement, she seemed strangely tense during dinner, especially when conversations shifted toward personal accomplishments. She did not voice anything directly yet. I caught the subtle comments she slipped between sentences about how every member of a family should support one another, no matter how inconvenient it might feel in the moment. I sensed something behind those remarks, but did not understand her intention until the following week. It became clearer when my sister Jenna encountered trouble with her job and returned home looking exhausted from long hours and unstable expectations. During several meals, Mom leaned into the subject as if she had rehearsed exactly how to frame Jenna's situation in a way that pressed responsibility onto my shoulders. She mentioned repeatedly that Jenna's work required constant driving across town, which she insisted was nearly impossible with the unreliable car Jenna currently owned. She shaped the conversation around sacrifice and obligations, with a careful tone designed to sound measured rather than manipulative, yet her message reached me with growing intensity. Over time, the pattern sharpened because my mom repeated the same theme every time we sat down for dinner, claiming that Jenna was facing real hardship that needed immediate support. She emphasized that I should not distance myself from the challenges of someone related to me, especially a sister who had always tried her best even when circumstances worked against her. Each conversation pierced deeper as she made me question whether keeping the new car for myself reflected selfishness rather than practicality. She told me that I had stability while Jenna was struggling to hold things together, and her phrasing always carried the weight of a moral argument rather than a simple suggestion. Eventually, I felt cornered emotionally because refusing seemed like a betrayal of the family values she repeated so convincingly. Even though the Tesla made my commute smoother and symbolized recognition of my progress, I reluctantly agreed to let my sister borrow it temporarily. The moment the decision left my mouth, a quiet wave of regret settled in my chest, because something about the request had not felt completely honest, although I could not identify what bothered me. Mom responded with an expression of relief that looked far too rehearsed for the situation, and she assured me that it would only be for a short period. She insisted that the arrangement should not cause conflict between sisters and asked me to maintain patience in order to avoid creating unnecessary tension in the house. She portrayed the deal as a simple temporary adjustment that would strengthen our family bond instead of weakening it, which made me feel as if declining would have labeled me uncaring toward the people I loved. Despite her reassurance, a small part of me sensed that giving up the Tesla opened a door I might later struggle to close. I handed over the keys with a smile that felt stiff, promising myself that it was only a loan and that everything would return to normal before long. 3 weeks later, the first signs of trouble settled into my days in ways I could no longer ignore. Jenna began extending her borrowing period with explanations that sounded polished enough to pass as reasonable, yet something in her voice never matched the urgency she claimed to be facing. She always described a new crisis at work, or a demanding deadline that required reliable transportation, and she emphasized how much the temporary arrangement had supposedly helped her keep things together. At first, I wanted to believe her because trusting my sister had long been the safer path in our family, but my patience began to stretch thin as her tone grew more rehearsed with each request. Mom supported Jenna without hesitation and told me I needed to stop creating pressure during what she called a delicate period. She repeated that sentence so often that it began echoing through my evenings, and she insisted Jenna deserved understanding while navigating the challenges she had been facing. I found myself listening to a familiar rhythm in Mom's words, a rhythm that always appeared whenever Jenna needed something. It gradually felt as if my concerns were being pushed aside to maintain the comfort of the people around me, and I struggled to understand why my feelings were so inconvenient to them. As the borrowed days multiplied, my dependence on ride shares started affecting my budget more than I had expected. Uber receipts piled into my inbox, and each one forced me to adjust my weekly spending to make room for another trip across Reno. Commuting became a small battle I fought every morning, especially when unexpected delays caught me off guard. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the inconvenience was temporary, yet the situation continued to expand in ways I had not prepared for. Each time I opened the app for another ride, I felt a quiet frustration building beneath the surface. Everything shifted the afternoon my best friend Haley texted me with a question I could not ignore. She mentioned seeing Jenna driving an old sedan through a grocery store parking lot, and her confusion seeped through every word she typed. Haley knew about the Tesla and assumed Jenna would be using it, so the image of my sister in a completely different vehicle unsettled us both. I stared at the message for several minutes, replaying it in my mind while trying to make sense of how Jenna had access to a car that did not belong to anyone in our family. The longer I considered it, the more the details clashed with every explanation Jenna had given me. When I asked Mom about the discrepancy, her response carried a quickness that felt almost practiced. She claimed the Tesla was undergoing maintenance at a specialized shop and suggested Haley must have mistaken someone else for Jenna. Her dismissal arrived too quickly, and the ease with which she brushed off my concern left a heavy weight in my chest. I had heard similar tones from Mom before, tones usually reserved for moments when she wanted a problem to disappear without further discussion. As we continued talking, I noticed how her comments drifted around my questions instead of addressing them directly. The inconsistencies between Jenna and Mom grew more noticeable with every conversation I attempted to have. Jenna mentioned minor repairs that supposedly required more time, while Mom insisted the car was in perfect condition other than routine maintenance. Their stories began overlapping in ways that failed to align, and the details they offered slipped further from anything that resembled the truth. I started keeping mental notes of each explanation, hoping the inconsistencies were simply the byproduct of stress rather than something more significant. Yet the tension forming in my stomach told me otherwise. Sleepless nights returned as I replayed our conversations over and over, trying to find a thread that tied everything together. I began wondering whether something irreversible had happened to the Tesla, and every possibility felt heavier than the last. The uncertainty settled into my evenings, stretching into the early hours while I stared at the ceiling in silence. It became difficult to focus on work when the thought of losing the car crept into my mind at unexpected moments. By the end of the third week, suspicion had wrapped itself around every explanation I received, and I reluctantly accepted that the truth, whatever it was, might not be something I would like. The following afternoon, I drove to my parents' house without announcing my visit because the uncertainty had grown into something I could no longer ignore. I walked up the familiar pathway while rehearsing the questions I had avoided for too long, hoping that confronting the issue directly would finally reveal the truth that neither Mom nor Jenna seemed willing to share. My heart pounded harder with each step, but the determination that pushed me forward felt stronger than my nerves. Mom opened the door with a look of surprise that vanished almost instantly as she invited me inside with a practiced calmness. I stood in the entryway long enough to steady my breath before asking where my car was, and I kept my voice steady even though frustration had been building for weeks. "I need to know exactly where the Tesla is," I said as clearly as I could. "If it is being repaired, I want the name of the shop and the paperwork." My words carried a firmness that I did not attempt to soften because the situation had already crossed every boundary I had tried to maintain. Mom folded her arms and replied that the Tesla was still at a garage that handled specialized electric vehicles, and she reminded me that families were supposed to trust one another. She added that constant questioning could damage relationships, which felt like an attempt to redirect the conversation rather than address my concern. Her tone conveyed an expectation that I should accept her explanation without further inquiry, yet something about the way she spoke increased my doubts rather than easing them. Before I could respond, Jenna walked into the room with an expression that lingered somewhere between annoyance and caution. I repeated my question about the Tesla, keeping my tone steady even as irritation crept into my voice. Jenna repeated the same story Mom had given me, insisting the car needed additional work, and claiming she had been calling the shop every few days for updates. Her explanation avoided every detail that mattered. She offered no dates, no repair descriptions, no receipts, and no timeline for when the car would be ready. The more she talked, the more it felt like she was building a wall of vague statements to hide behind. Each sentence drifted away from the simple facts I had asked for, and her refusal to meet my eyes for more than a moment told me she knew her answers were insufficient. Mom's expression tightened as I questioned Jenna again, focusing on the inconsistencies that had been accumulating for weeks. Her discomfort grew with every attempt I made to clarify the situation, and she stepped in as if she needed to protect Jenna from further questioning. I could feel the shift in the room as both of them tried to maintain a united front, yet neither could offer a straightforward answer. The tension felt suffocating as I realized their frustration stemmed not from my questions, but from the possibility that their narrative might fall apart. Jenna finally admitted she did not have the paperwork with her because she had left everything somewhere at home, which only deepened my concern. The more she attempted to justify herself, the more her voice wavered, and the absence of confidence in her explanation revealed more than she intended. She still avoided looking directly at me, and each time she turned her gaze away, a deeper resentment settled into my chest. The silence that followed grew heavier until it became clear that staying longer would not lead me any closer to the truth. I realized that neither Mom nor Jenna would offer information they had worked so hard to withhold, and pushing further would only deepen the divide that had been growing between us. I stepped toward the door with the quiet understanding that I needed to uncover the truth on my own. I left the house without another word, determined to find out exactly what they were hiding from me. 1 week later, the information I uncovered sent a chill through me that lingered long after the calls ended. I had spent several nights turning over every unanswered question in my mind, and I finally reached a point where hoping for honesty no longer felt reasonable. The only way to understand what had happened to my car was to go directly to the sources that could not twist the truth. Early that morning, I contacted my insurance provider to ask whether any recent claims or updates had been filed for my Tesla, intending to rule out the possibility of an accident Jenna had not mentioned. The representative placed me on a brief hold before returning with a tone that signaled something unusual. She informed me that the primary ownership on record had been altered a few weeks earlier, and the system showed a legal transfer rather than a routine administrative correction. My stomach tightened as she explained that the change had been processed through documents submitted electronically. I felt a hollow weight settle in my chest because the situation had shifted from inconvenience to something far more deliberate. I had never signed anything related to a transfer of ownership, and hearing that the records no longer listed me as the sole owner felt like stepping into cold water. After ending the call, I drove to the Tesla dealership near Reno, hoping they could confirm whether the car was undergoing repairs or if it had even been checked in at all. A service advisor pulled up the vehicle's identification number and reviewed the history, while I waited with a tension that grew heavier by the second. He eventually shook his head and told me that the car had not been brought in for repairs at any location within their network. His certainty left no room for interpretation, and I felt the last pieces of Mom's and Jenna's explanation collapse under the weight of documented facts. The advisor asked if I wanted to file a report regarding unauthorized activity, but I declined until I could gather more information. I returned to my car and sat in silence as the reality settled deeper into my thoughts. The transfer of ownership meant someone had accessed my personal information without permission, and the absence of any repair record made it increasingly clear that the Tesla was no longer where my family claimed it was. I contacted the state's vehicle registration office to request verification of the title activity, and the clerk confirmed that a transfer had been processed through an online portal. He also confirmed that the new ownership had been finalized without requiring my physical signature because the digital authorization box had been checked. Hearing those details ignited a mixture of anger and disbelief that pulsed through me. The paperwork reflected a timeline that aligned almost exactly with the period Jenna had been borrowing the car, which made the implications even more painful. I replayed our conversations in my mind, remembering the rehearsed tone Jenna used and the practiced calmness Mom adopted whenever I asked for clarity. Each new detail revealed how meticulously they had kept the truth hidden, and the betrayal grew heavier as I assembled the pieces into a coherent picture. Dad had been away on a long business trip during this entire ordeal, and I realized that waiting for him to return would give me the one advantage I needed: a voice of authority who understood the gravity of financial boundaries. I chose to stay silent about my discoveries until Dad came home, because his presence would prevent Mom and Jenna from twisting the narrative into something that placed blame anywhere except where it belonged. The following days felt strangely calm, but beneath that calmness lived a growing resolve. I knew a confrontation was inevitable, and I began preparing myself for the moment when the truth would finally be forced into the open. That evening carried a kind of uneasy quiet that followed me from the sidewalk to the front door, and the moment I stepped inside, I sensed a tension that felt entirely different from the usual atmosphere of Dad's home. I had arrived in an Uber again because I had no other option yet. I tried to steady myself before walking into the dining room where everyone was already waiting. Dad had returned from his long work trip only a few hours earlier, and I felt his eyes on me before I could even greet him properly. He pushed his chair back with a slow, bewildered movement as I placed my purse on the nearest counter, and I realized he was studying the situation with growing confusion. He finally spoke with a tone that carried both authority and disbelief, asking clearly, "Why are you arriving in an Uber? What happened to the Tesla I bought you?" His voice echoed through the room in a way that forced every person at the table to look up. I tried to draw a breath to explain something despite not knowing what to say, but Mom interrupted smoothly with an answer that sounded far too practiced to be spontaneous. She said, "Jenna needed the car more. Her voice had a strangely calm certainty that made the entire explanation feel rehearsed rather than sincere. She stayed seated yet held her fork in a way that suggested she had no intention of allowing me to say another word. Dad stood with a force that shook the edge of the table, although he did not raise his voice at first. His jaw tightened in a way I had rarely seen, and he repeated the question with a sharper tone that cut through the room. When no one offered an explanation, he finally yelled, "Bring her out here right now." His chair scraped back as he stepped away from the table, and the command carried enough weight to freeze Mom in place. Jenna emerged from the hallway after several seconds of heavy silence, and her nervous posture exposed more truth than any explanation she might have attempted. She avoided looking at me or Dad, choosing instead to stare at the carpet as if it could shield her from accountability. Dad demanded an answer immediately, asking her to explain what had happened to the Tesla, and he gave her no opportunity to delay. Jenna attempted a vague justification, at first trying to claim mechanical issues or paperwork complications, yet each sentence drifted away without detail. Her voice trembled while she insisted everything had been temporary, although even she seemed unconvinced by her own excuses. Dad waited without moving, and the longer he remained silent, the more unstable Jenna's composure became. Eventually, her words collapsed into fragmented explanations that led nowhere, and her breathing grew uneven as she grasped for anything that sounded believable. Her restraint finally broke, and tears spilled before she could hide them. She admitted the truth with a strained voice, explaining that she had sold the Tesla to cover personal debts she had been hiding for months. She confessed that she felt trapped, and she had believed that selling the car would solve everything quickly. She said she had always intended to replace it before anyone noticed, yet her plan unraveled from the moment the money left her account. She cried harder when she admitted she had signed papers that were not hers to sign. Mom lowered her gaze and whispered an apology toward Dad, acknowledging that she had known about the sale and had attempted to protect Jenna by keeping the truth hidden. She explained that she thought the situation would resolve itself quietly, yet she now realized she had allowed it to escalate into something far more damaging. She wiped her eyes while she apologized to me as well, although her voice remained barely audible. The room settled into a silence heavy enough to blur every sound except the faint hum of the kitchen lights, and even that seemed to fade as Dad processed everything. I remained seated without speaking because the truth revealed itself clearly enough without any additional commentary from me. The next morning, Dad asked me to come to his office for a private conversation. I arrived early because I sensed the conversation would determine the direction of my relationship with my family. Dad gestured for me to sit across from his desk, while he reviewed several documents that had been prepared overnight. His tone was calm, although his expression showed the weight of the decision he had already made. He explained that he had contacted the insurance company before he called me because he needed an independent confirmation of the ownership status. They informed him that I remained the sole legal owner of the Tesla, which meant the sale had no lawful standing. He paused long enough for me to understand the seriousness of the violation. Dad told me that the transfer of ownership required my verified signature, which had never been provided. The missing authentication demonstrated that someone had attempted to manipulate the paperwork in a way that could expose our family to legal consequences. He made it clear that the act itself was not only deceitful, but also criminal under Nevada regulations governing vehicle ownership. Hearing this from him helped me understand the full extent of what Jenna had done, which deepened the sense of distance that had already grown between us. Dad then shifted the conversation to a matter he had been considering for several months. He believed that his continuous financial support had created a harmful dependency that encouraged reckless behavior. He told me that he would end all discretionary assistance for Mom and Jenna to ensure accountability. He emphasized that independence must be restored to prevent similar incidents from happening again. The decision reflected a significant shift in how he intended to manage the household finances. Although I felt conflicted, I understood why he needed to recalibrate the boundaries that had been blurred for so long. When Dad spoke about Jenna, his tone changed. He explained that she would be required to reimburse the full market value of the Tesla. The payments would be structured through a written agreement prepared by his attorney. The arrangement would force her to carry responsibility for her decisions rather than pass the burden to someone else. He believed that learning through consequences would be more valuable than any lecture he could deliver. I remained silent because I needed time to adjust to the magnitude of what had unfolded. Dad also addressed Mom's involvement. He shared that she had accessed a household fund he managed for emergencies, and she had used it to conceal the financial gap created by Jenna's actions. He said that she would be required to return the amount she had misused through a repayment schedule identical to Jenna's. The decision stunned me because I had not realized how deeply Mom had entangled herself in the situation. Dad stressed that honesty needed to be reestablished at the center of the family structure, and this would be the first corrective step. As the conversation progressed, I explained that I needed distance to regain clarity. I told Dad that I could no longer remain involved in a dynamic that continuously harmed my emotional well-being. He listened carefully and agreed that stepping back would help me rebuild the stability I had lost. He reassured me that I did not need to carry the burden of repairing relationships that others had damaged. His support brought relief because it validated what I had been struggling to accept for weeks. Before I left, Dad opened a sealed folder. Inside was an updated version of his will. He told me that he had decided to revise his estate plan so that the primary assets would be transferred to me. He explained that the decision was not a punishment for Mom and Jenna, but a protective measure to safeguard my future. I felt overwhelmed because the change symbolized a level of trust I had never expected. The gravity of the situation hung between us even as he expressed confidence in my ability to handle the responsibility. I walked out of his office with a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The consequences were real and they were necessary. The path ahead would not be simple yet. It marked the first moment in a long time when I felt capable of standing on my own. 2 months later, my life had shifted into an entirely different chapter. I woke up each morning with a sense of control that had been missing from my life for years. The distance I created from Mom and Jenna turned into a boundary that helped me feel grounded, and I used the clarity it brought to rebuild the things that had been slowly stripped away from me. One of those steps involved purchasing a new car with my own savings. Signing the documents with my name printed beside every line allowed me to reclaim the confidence that had been shaken by months of deception. The freedom of owning something without interference helped me settle into a lifestyle that finally belonged to me. My relationship with Dad grew deeper as he continued showing me the steadiness that had guided his decisions during the confrontation. We spoke more often, and each conversation carried a tone that reminded me that trust could be rebuilt when it rested on honesty. He checked in on me regularly not because he doubted my independence, but because he wanted to ensure the emotional wounds left by the betrayal had a chance to heal. His presence became a quiet reassurance that I deserved respect within the family, even if 2 people closest to me had ignored that truth for too long. Life for Mom and Jenna became more complicated once Dad's financial support ended. The absence of constant assistance forced them to face the reality they had avoided through excuses and emotional manipulation. Jenna struggled with the repayment agreement, which pushed her to find a second job during late evening hours. She tried to remain composed whenever she interacted with extended relatives, yet everyone saw the shift in her behavior when she could no longer rely on others to cushion her mistakes. Her choices had caught up to her, and the consequences followed her through every step of her repayment schedule. Mom dealt with her own challenges as she adjusted to managing expenses without the comfort of Dad's unconditional help. She tried reaching out a few times to persuade me to re-engage with the family dynamic, yet each attempt lacked accountability. She focused on the discomfort she faced, rather than acknowledging the breach of trust she helped create. I recognize those conversations as attempts to restore familiar patterns, so I remained firm with the boundaries that had allowed me to regain my emotional balance. Protecting my well-being became more important than accepting apologies that lacked sincerity. As the weeks passed, I discovered that peace did not arrive through reconciliation. It arrived through acceptance of distance. I no longer felt responsible for carrying relationships that repeatedly dismissed my feelings. The guilt that once kept me tied to unhealthy expectations faded as I realized that choosing myself was not selfish. It was survival. I watched my life stabilize while I focused on work friendships and quiet evenings in my home that finally felt like a sanctuary instead of an escape. Freedom from the chaos helped me rebuild my sense of identity in ways I had not experienced before. Dad respected my decision to limit contact. He never questioned it because he understood the importance of letting people reveal their true intentions without shielding them from the consequences. His revised estate plan remained in place, although he never brought it up again. He allowed the change to speak for itself, which carried a message that felt stronger than any apology Mom or Jenna had attempted to offer. Through his actions, he reminded me that loyalty should never demand the sacrifice of my dignity. By the end of the second month, I realized that closure did not come from dramatic conversations or emotional reconciliations. It came from the quiet certainty that I no longer needed validation from people who had chosen their own convenience over my trust. The life I rebuilt belonged entirely to me, shaped by decisions made with clarity rather than pressure. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe in my own story. Healthy boundaries protect us from patterns that quietly drain our sense of worth. Giving in to unreasonable demands may feel easier in the moment, yet it often invites deeper harm. Ownership, whether emotional or material, deserves to be respected without negotiation. When people misuse trust, consequences become necessary for growth. Choosing distance is not cruelty. It is a commitment to preserving your well-being even when the people involved are those you once loved most. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Your time and openness mean more than I can express. If you have ever experienced something similar or learned your own lessons about boundaries and self-respect, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective may help someone who is still searching for clarity in their own journey.